Hi, good morning, everyone. Everyone who's in the room and also watching from home. What I'm going to talk to you today about is a project that was funded by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, which was, as it says on the title there, looking at setting scarcity and rarity thresholds for Irish invertebrates, and also looking at whether there are ways that we could improve the way that we map the distribution of invertebrates. So as I say, many thanks to Parks and Wildlife Service, particularly Brian, for all his help on the project, and to the Parks and Wildlife Service for the funding. I was kind of leading on the project, but ably helped by Mike Lush, who's now working at a company called iDocs. And if anybody ever does need a spatial data analyst, I can thoroughly recommend having a chat with Mike. He's been absolutely brilliant on this project. Just trying to find the page down. Oh, there it is. Lovely. Okay, so a quick description of what the project covered. And this is the order in which I'll talk through things in the presentation. First section is on some novel sort of statistical mapping of distribution that we looked at. The second part, which is really the meat of the project, is, as I say, setting those rarity and scarcity thresholds for Irish invertebrates. I'll talk at a fairly high level about that. We're planning to publish this sometime, I think, in the next couple of months, Brian, on in Irish wildlife manual format. So that will be available on the internet for anybody who wants to download it. So if you check on the Irish Wildlife Manual page of the Parks and Wildlife Service, probably in a few months' time, it should be up there with a bit of luck. I'm also going to talk about some work we did on kind of other descriptors of geographical distribution. So first of all, a little bit on the data that we used in the study. This is the only place in which I managed to shoehorn some nice pictures of invertebrates into the presentation. I'm disappointed to say, but the two data sets that we picked were macro moths and water beetles. You may ask, why did we pick those? And I'll just explain briefly. Macro moths is a very large data set, not just in terms of the numbers of species involved, but it's also large in terms of the numbers of records per species. The moths are also recorded by different groups of people, potentially from water beetles. So with moths, we've got a very wide recorder base of people with different skill levels. Water beetles, on the other hand, we've got fewer taxa. There's about 200 species of water beetles, as opposed to 700 or 800 for moths. And they're recorded generally by people who are a smaller group of people who tend to have a very deep specialist interest in them. It's not always the case, but generally speaking, that's true. And that gave us a bit of a contrast in the analysis between two different types of data. The other key reason is that both of these have been red listed, so we've got a reasonable degree of confidence that the data is accurate and fairly clean. What we didn't want to do was spend an awful lot of time and effort as part of the project doing data cleaning, and we've managed to avoid that by using those two particular data sets. We could have picked others, but those were just the two that we went with. So moving on to the sort of distribution mapping side of things, I appreciate there's an awful lot of very small writing on there, but I hope you can sort of see most of that at least. This looks probably a little bit different from some of the distribution mapping that we've seen before. So right at the top there, we've got the taxon name. In this particular case, I think that's the lunar hornet moth, which lives in the trunks of willow trees in wet areas. So the sort of novel things that we've done, looking at the other boxes down on the left-hand side there, the occupied hectads are all marked either in yellow or pink boxes. The pink boxes are inland records, so ones that we've deemed to be inland. The blue boxes are ones that are close to the coast. So they're within all the hectads that are within 1 kilometre of the coast. And that's quite useful looking at Irish species, because not an awful lot, but a reasonable proportion of them seem to be quite closely tied to coastal habitats. And we'll have a look at some examples of those a bit later on. So the deeper the colour of those boxes means the more records we have of that particular species. So as ever with data that may not always be perfect, that needs to be read with a little bit of caution. So we may have some iconic type of species. So Rose was talking about scarce crimson and gold, Pyrrhosta sanguinalis earlier. It's not a species that's very widespread, but there's probably quite a few records of it because it's something that people have been out looking for. For many other species, particularly things that are quite common and widespread, even though they're actually very abundant out there, there are a few records because nobody ever bothers recording them. So some of these things need to be sort of read with a little bit of caution, but it does give you a bit of an idea, not only about their geographic distribution, but also about their abundance, as I say, with that little bit of caution applied to it. On the left-hand side and the bottom of the picture in front of you, there's what are called box and whisker plots. So again, this is a useful means of showing how widely populations of invertebrates are distributed within Ireland. So the whisker, which is the really thin line that extends above and below the plot, that contains 95% of the population of that particular species. The box contains 50% of that species. So when we look at this one, if you drew lines going up from there, across from that box there, that will give you a square where 50% of the population of that species exists. So it's just a really useful kind of way of giving a bit more information about how our invertebrates are distributed. So that works great for things where you've got either a very even distribution or you've got a single grouping within Ireland. Doesn't work so well where you've got what might refer to as a bimodal distribution. So where you've got, if we had two groups of population, maybe one down here and one up there, that's not a great way of looking at it. So again, a little bit of caution needs to be applied. But I have to say, it was one of the more interesting things that we worked on, and it does give some quite surprising results. So we've got hundreds and hundreds of these little charts, one for each species in the macro moth data set and the water beetle data set. And it does show up some quite interesting results for some of those species, things that you wouldn't necessarily kind of expect to see happening. The final thing to mention is down at the bottom, against each of these diagrams, we've got this little bit of information down here. So that's within there, there's a description of the distribution, year of the latest record, and a normalized hectare abundance score, which is not something I'm going to go into in any detail now, but it gives it's another indication of kind of the distribution and abundance of the species. So moving on to setting thresholds. Why do we do this? There's a number of reasons for this, really. As somebody who spends a lot of time out in the wilderness collecting invertebrates, identifying them, and then writing really lovely reports about them, we've got no consistent way at the moment of describing where all those things are. And we see lots of different terms used, like locally common, frequent, abundant, scarce, and rare, and all these things mean slightly different things to different people. There's no rigor to it. And whilst we will all have an idea in our own head about what those terms mean to us, there's no guarantee that everybody interprets them in the same way. Excuse me. One of the other reasons why we wanted to do it was because I think it's really helpful to members of the public and policymakers who may not have necessarily, just really making information accessible to them. Really helpful to be able to say to, as an entomologist, to be able to say to somebody in a report, this species is rare and it's within a recognised scheme that tells you that it's rare or it's scarce. That's really why we did it, to be honest. What we haven't done in this piece of work is consider anything at all about risk. That's quite an important point. This doesn't look at risk of extinction. All that sort of thing is covered in red listing, which I think Brian is going to talk about in a minute. In setting the thresholds, there's no kind of magic number here. There's no completely logical way of coming up with a number that's right, but we've done the best we can. And everybody may have a slightly different opinion, but I think what we've got is a reasonable first step. The one thing that we haven't done as part of this project is our analysis so far has been based entirely upon statistical analysis of the data sets. What we haven't done at this stage is provide any form of expert opinion into validating that. So it needs to be kind of looked at in that light. And I think the expert opinion input is very important, and we may well see some changes at that point. And there's no reason at that point why we couldn't change some of these thresholds. So as part of the project, we did a bit of a look around at what's going on internationally. There seems to be very little happening, at least that we could find, anywhere else in the world apart from England. And England have had rarity and scarcity thresholds set for their invertebrates for quite a number of decades now. And again, you know, that was one thing that we did sort of look at and take into account as part of this work. But it wasn't an overall sort of guiding thing, really. This is very much a system that's suited to Ireland and not an adaptation of the English thresholds. So if we look at what we've come up with in Ireland, the definition of rare is that it occurs in 10 hectads or fewer. The definition of scarce is that it occurs in 11 to 50 hectads. So rare would include about 1% of the land area of Ireland. That's quite a small amount of land, which is kind of what you'd expect. And out of the two data sets we looked at, that would include 8% of the macro moths and 15% of the water beetles. So moving on to scarce, 11 to 50 hectads is about 6% of the land mass. So again, that feels kind of about right to me in terms of what a reasonable definition of scarce in Ireland might be. And that covers 21% of the macro moth data set, and it includes 31% of the water beetle data set. We may well choose to split scarce into two separate categories of A and B. So 11 to 50 hectads is quite a big jump up from 10, and there may be some merit in splitting that scarce into a scarce A and scarce B category. That was done for the English classifications, but it was then dropped. I have no idea why they chose to drop it from the British system. One of the reasons why that may be a beneficial thing for us is that if we split it to 10 to 25 hectads, that would then, or the scarce A into 10 to 25 hectads, that would give us a measure of consistency with the system that's just come out from BSBI. So their definition of scarce is 10 to 25 hectads for all the plants in Ireland, which I think is a useful thing to do. So just to put that in context with the British rarity and scarcity values, so rare is 15 or fewer hectads. But bear in mind that the land area of Britain is approximately 3 times greater than that of the island of Ireland. The other thing I should have mentioned already that I didn't is that all the work that we've done applies to the island of Ireland and not just the Republic of Ireland. So it's considering Ireland as a single biogeographical unit. Scarce in Britain is 16 to 100 hectads. And again, just to provide a little bit more context, so this table on the bottom right-hand side, you can see a number of some sets of data from some of the British data sets. So for caddisflies, 46% of the taxa are included in their scheme. For ground beetles, it's 50%. Some of those numbers seem very high to me, but I'll come on to that in a minute. Stoneflies, 26%. So when we look at the figures over on the left, they're kind of roughly on a par with, sort of coincidentally, with the scheme that we've come up with, albeit some of those groups are significantly higher. Why are those groups significantly higher? Hard to put a precise reason on it, but it may well be something to do with the greater diversity of habitat types in Britain, a number of which may well be quite geographically limited. So that will give you a higher number of rare and scarce invertebrates, which may well be quite a legitimate thing. So moving swiftly on to geographic descriptors, the things that we've looked at here are coastal distribution, which we've already talked about a little bit. So we pulled out basically separately identified any hectad that is within 1 kilometre of the coast. And we've done some statistical analysis around that to identify invertebrates that have got a coastal bias. We've split the country using eastings and northings into northern, eastern, southern and western categories. One of the things that was surprising from this bit of work, when I started out, I'd sort of assumed intuitively that lots and lots of species would demonstrate these kinds of geographical biases within Ireland. And in fact, that turns out not to be the case. That most of them are much more sort of thinly spread across the island. We've also split it into quadrants, so northeast, northwest, southwest and southeast. And finally, we came up with a description of Apache distribution. So that's where things occur in kind of clumps, for want of a better term, across the island. So it appears in some areas, but not others, basically. Here's just a few examples of some of those. So on the far left-hand side there, we've got netted pug, which is very much a coastal beast, and it's very coastal because it feeds on, I think, Silene species, which are only found around the coast. So that automatically gives it quite a limited coastal geographic distribution. But you can see from that picture that there is in fact only 1 hectad there, which is down in the southwest, that's not a coast, regarded by our analysis as a coastal hectad. So the next one along is the birch angle, which we've determined through our statistical analysis to have a very much a southwestern bias. So I picked, for the purposes of this demonstration, I picked some of the more extreme examples just to sort of make it clear what we were talking about. And the final one, straw bell, this has got both a patchy and southern distribution. That's just a couple of quick examples for it. So finally, just a slide on potential areas of future work, really. So the obvious one that we will need doing before this system can be used in anger, I think, is all those results we've got so far need some sort of expert opinion put around them. Are they sort of legitimate, or do they need to be changed because they're wrong due to under-recording or something else? There's an awful lot of other groups that could potentially be considered. So there's red-listed, many other red-listed groups that we could draw in. And I think there's quite a lot of scope to further refine the sort of geographic descriptors. And that's it from me. So hopefully we'll have a few minutes for any questions.
Thank you, Adam. I'm interested to see that you have a figure for caddisflies, 40%, and yet caddisflies are not yet red listed, and I'm just really interested in seeing how the red listing and the square listing threshold of that two tie together.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the 46% figure came from the British red list. I personally would see this rarity and scarcity as something that might be taken into account during the red listing process, but because it does not give any consideration at all to threat of extinction, it's not, which is what the red listing process is all about. It's not a substitute for it at all. It is kind of a completely separate separate thing. Would you kind of agree with that, Brian? Yeah, okay.
Maybe touch on that. I'll touch on that when I'm.
Great. Are there any other questions?
So can I just quick one? So is it what's like percentage of available mass scarcity? Is that separated for say freshwater? For example, percentage of available freshwater habitat to determine the scarcity, or just everything?
No, so there's no differentiation between aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates. It's sort of intuitively, you might have thought that perhaps the aquatic things would appear rarer and scarcer because the availability of their habitat is probably, there's lots of Ireland that is purely terrestrial. But looking at the figures that we came up with, we actually got, I think slightly more in the rare and scarce categories for water beetles as opposed to moths. But the difference wasn't dramatic, so that's not something I'd be overly necessarily concerned about. And what we're considering in this scheme is only distribution. It's nothing else. It's not abundance. It's purely an assessment of the distribution. So I wouldn't necessarily see that as a particular issue.
Okay, thank you, Adam.
Okay, thank you.
Next, we're going to be welcoming Brian Nelson.